Lovely. Got my cue, very exciting, nearly there. Back to see Mark Thompson in exclusive live interview with Eric Schmidt, the CEO and chairman of Google Live TV. How exciting is that? By the way, as a BBC employee, I think it's only fair to point out there are other search engines available. You can Google them if you want to find out more. So listen, first of all, just to tee Mark up, here's a quick film that tells you 5 things you need to know about Google by Laura Trevelyan in our New York office. Thanks.
You already know Google is the most dominant search engine on the planet. But here's a quick guide to the key issues which could define the future of the world's most powerful brand. Google made a profit of $1.48 billion in the second quarter of this year. While doom and gloom reigns in much of the corporate media world, Google's finances look to be in robust good health. In the second quarter of this year, the company's profits were up by 18%. While newspapers and TV continue to wave goodbye to their advertising dollars, Google is sitting pretty. It gets 97% of its revenue from advertising. So here's the big question. Is Google moving away from being merely an aggregator of content to becoming a provider? On October the 7th, a New York judge will begin to rule on Google's controversial book deal. Google has been quietly making digital copies of 10 million books, including out-of-print and out-of-copyright titles. The idea is to revitalise long-forgotten works and to make money out of them, of course. After publishers and authors sued Google for breach of copyright, a settlement of $125 million was reached. Now a New York judge will rule on whether or not to block that settlement. So for now, Google's plans to make money out of the past are on hold. But how about the present? Every minute, 20 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube. The billion-dollar question is whether Google can make money out of our obsession with YouTube. Google bought YouTube for a whopping $1.65 billion in 2006, and the video-sharing site has lost money ever since. Google won't say how much YouTube is in the red, but estimates vary from between $150 to $500 million a year. Michael Grade famously called Google and YouTube parasites, living off the content of others, a criticism which may have hit home. Google may help newspapers sell their articles online. Having fought with the newspaper industry over its new search engine, now Google is making nice. The company's revealed that its checkout product, used by internet retailers, could be adapted so newspaper sites could sell their articles. While this may come too late to help the ailing newspapers, could the same technology be applied to video? And Google's generosity might help stave off those pesky regulators. The European Commission is updating its data protection directive. And those Eurocrats have Google in their sights. The Commission is taking a close look at whether Google's wildly popular Street View is actually invading our privacy. And the EU is focusing on how internet search engines store information on our shopping and our surfing, which is often used for unsolicited advertising. But Google's business model is highly reliant on those cookies which store the information on us. The company's unofficial motto was "Don't be evil," and that could be resurrected as the lobbying in Brussels intensifies. So that's our view of Google from the outside. Now for the perspective from the Googleplex itself.
Right, so we have Eric Schmidt, I think, in New York looking at us. Can you hear me, Eric? It's Mark Thompson here. Excellent. Okay, well...
Yes, hi, Mark. And
hi there. We've been spent the whole day debating the future of television, the challenge of different monetization models. Now, one theme that's come up today is an organization which is described as dominant, has a terrible chilling effect on every aspect of broadcasting in this country. Now, I have to say, people have generally meant the BBC when they said that, but I have to say sometimes your name comes up too. This is a big topic, the scale, the scope. And in particular, you heard the famous parasite phrase a moment ago there. The extent to which Google sits on other people's investment, the extent to which Google actually reinvests. Let me give you we've had a lot of questions from people here on this topic, but let me give you an example. Janice Hughes, who's here, asks, having successfully siphoned off hundreds of millions of the UK's media ad spend, in what ways might Google invest in original UK content? Somebody else asks us, how much do you actually plough back to UK content providers? How do you answer those questions?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there. I could not physically get there, given some commitments I had here in New York. But this is obviously an important group and an important, you all have existed, I think, since the 1930s. This group started as a debating society for technology and engineering and television, which is something I care a lot about. I think it's helpful when you have these sort of conversations and questions you're describing to try to figure out what does the world like 10 years, 15, 20 years from now. And in all of those cases, the most important thing to know is that people are going to have a lot more choices how they consume television and media. In particular, they're going to consume the kind of media that we think of as television on a lot of devices that are not traditional televisions. And over that 10 to 15 year period, the kind of quality and technology that we can bring to, for example, mobile devices will really change the landscape of how people consume video, news programming, all the things that all of us care about. This is true in television. It's also true in newspapers. So from Google's perspective, we're used to the criticism, so we don't mind it at all. And in fact, we welcome it because it helps us understand what we should be doing differently. From our perspective, we are essentially a conduit for how end users want to consume content. To the specific charges, the content that we make available to end users, we get with the permission of the people who do the content. So even in the book settlement, the issue was not copyrighted content. The issue was things that have lapsed from copyright. So on the specific questions about how much money are we plowing back in, we're beginning to plow a fair amount. As YouTube, for example, becomes profitable, more and more of the money that we can make, we will essentially plow back into content. We need the content industries, and they'll be monetized in our model primarily using advertising. If you go 10 or 15 years out, it's probably the case that you're going to end up with advertising models as well as micropayment and subscription models for content. And we're going to work on all of them to make sure that if you have great content, which people in this audience clearly do, that you can decide whether you want it to be advertiser supported or whether you want people to pay a subscription or what have you.
And Kelly, I'll ask people in the audience here to respond to that. But before they do so, can you give us any numbers, Eric, in terms of the kind of money that's coming back to content providers in this country, in the UK, from Google and/or YouTube?
Well, in the case of content in general, we ship about $5 or $6 billion globally back into content through a set of advertising products which are called AdSense. And part of our strategy is to take those products and make them even more suitable for the video experience, the radio experience, the newspaper experience. These advertising products are highly targeted, and so over time we think that they will actually be more profitable than the traditional advertising models. They are not today, fundamentally because people are consuming, if you will, less of the media in the new format as they did in the old traditional television format on a time-weighted basis. But our goal is to make large amounts of money for the content partners in all of these categories. So to give you rough numbers, if you assume the UK is roughly 15% of that, that would say that we're well above $500 million or some number of hundreds of millions of pounds already.
Okay, well, what I want to do is I want to on this topic of the flow back of money. First of all, Janice Hughes is here. Janice, do you want to ask Eric anything, having heard that? Was that reassuring? Down here in the third row.
Eric, I think my question was aimed at the fact that there's a lot of money, everyone's been talking about it today, flowing out of the media sector, but particularly the content production, the original content production industry here in the UK. And, I mean, at what point in the future will we actually see that funding possibly coming back to pay for programmes, to support the broadcasters, as opposed to it just simply disappearing and them having to scrabble around for new money, or simply reduce the programme budgets, which is what we're sort of suffering from at the moment compared with, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I don't know how to answer the general question that you asked because there are so many components that go into the revenue that you all make. What I do know is that advertisers are moving to the internet, and that the internet should ultimately be a more targeted and therefore more effective advertising vehicle than the traditional television model. If you go again, I appreciate the BBC is not primarily advertiser supported, but talk about the commercial networks. In the United States, as an example, my television shows me ads for products that I'll never buy. Products like baby products and things like that. There's no baby in the house. That's a waste of a time slot. We have invented and are in the process of deploying systems which sit on your set-top box, which give targeted ads to the household, to the set-top box precisely. And so a reasonable step is to assume that there's a transition going on from untargeted broadcast television advertising to targeted advertising. As to the general question of where the advertising money is going to go, we know that overall untargeted advertising is going down and targeted is growing very rapidly. So to me, it's all about a race to getting more targeted advertising. And by the way, that's not just targeted through Google, it's also targeted through social networks and things like that. If you think about your mobile phone, eventually we know a lot about you on your mobile phone. We know where it is, we know who you are, we know what it's doing, we know a lot about your interests. So it should be possible to sell an advertiser, and of course Google is fundamentally an advertising company in the sense of our revenue is 98% revenue is advertising. We should be able to show a product that's highly, highly valuable to an advertiser.
Now, Eric, you said, I think you used the phrase, as YouTube becomes profitable. I couldn't quite work out whether that meant you believe it's already profitable or will become profitable. Can you give us a sense of a time frame? And also about whether you believe that that kind of ad-funded model is going to be successful and dominant in this space, or whether other kinds of monetization can also work.
First place, we believe YouTube will be profitable. We don't have a forecast for when it will be. It's not today, but its profitability is improving reasonably rapidly. And part of the reason is because we've invented new advertising products that are very similar to the kinds that I've been describing. We have a lot more coming. As to the general question of how will money get made here, you're seeing a long-term secular shift away from the model that we've all grown up with, which is people sitting around watching television and listening to the radio, to a much more mobile user who can consume information in any order in any way they want. My personal view is that much of that content will be advertiser supported or government subsidized in the case of public entities, but that fundamentally the viewer experience is going to shift. And you can see this when you look at people who are 5 and 10 years old, children today, that they're extremely comfortable consuming content on their Sony PlayStations, their iPhones, and things like that. And I can't see the screen because the screen's too small, but their eyes are good enough that they can see it. So I think there's every reason to believe that this next generation will have a very, very different viewing consumption pattern. It doesn't mean that they'll watch less. I would argue they'll probably watch more, but they'll watch it using a different device. Let me give you another example. There's a whole category of companies who are startups and even larger companies that are building boxes that combine the traditional broadcast television experience and viewing on the internet. And roughly think of it as a box which you connect to your television, and it can show you what's available on satellite television. It can show you what's available on licensed broadcast television over the air. It can show you what is on cable, if cable is predominant in your area. And it can also look on the internet. And you can then search and say, I want to see the best of, and it will search across all those 4 modalities. That's a big technology shift for the World Television Society's members and for all of us as consumers. But from my perspective, ultimately the consumer is going to win. They're going to want to have the convenience of seeing it in whatever its current format is, regardless of delivery mechanism. And in each of those categories, we're going to have to develop a monetization model so that the content provider can be properly compensated.
Okay. Now, a short time ago, Rupert Murdoch set out almost a kind of global call for news around the world. I guess he's thinking principally of text, but I think he'd apply this to other forms of news online, to go behind a paywall and to collectively move to a pay model. Do you think that that's a strategy which is likely to succeed? And what's Google's attitude to Rupert's call for a distinct shift in journalism towards pay?
Well, as you all know, a couple of the properties that News Corp owns, particularly the Wall Street Journal, do in fact have paywalls, and you do in fact have their content through subscription. And that's a model that has worked for them. In general, these models have not worked for general public consumption because there's enough free sources that the marginal value of paying is not justified based on the incremental value of quality. So my guess is that for niche markets, for specialized markets, a business market is a very important such example. It will be possible to do that, but I think it's unlikely that you'll be able to do it for all kind of news. There's simply too many news sources. There are too many ways in which news gets done. There are too many, if you will, news societies who will find an advertiser-supported as opposed to a paywall model work. And having said that, these are also negotiations. And so you should assume that we will be negotiating with all of these players to try to make sure that their content is as available as broadly as possible to people around the world.
Okay, so on this point, Peter Bazalgette, I think you have a question down here on the third row.
Eric, as YouTube struggles its way towards profitability, we can all see now it's largely doing it on the back of professional content, and it seems to be professional content that advertisers most wish to advertise around. Just to shift the scene slightly, does that spell the end of user-generated content as a commercial proposition? We've heard so much hype about it in the last 10 years. Clearly people enjoy it in the social sense, but does it spell the end of it as a commercial proposition?
Yeah. Just as a comment, you use the word "on the back of," and that implies some kind of duress, I think. The fact of the matter is that we have an aggressive and very successful commercial licensing program for YouTube where people willingly give us licensed content and we advertise against it. That's part of the why YouTube is becoming successful. If people upload content which has been illegally copied, we now have very sophisticated tools called content IT tools, which will allow the copyright owner to identify those and get them deleted, literally deleted. And this happens all the time, at least for me as a viewer on YouTube, when I'll type in some name and I'll discover that the content owner, in their judgment, decided to take it off of YouTube. We understand that and we support that model. On the question of overall user-generated content, I think the experiment is over, and it's very clear that the average person who generates user-generated content does not have the skills and quality of the people in this room. I think you just look at the video. And I think anybody who has this sort of utopian view that everyone can be a broadcaster at any reasonable quality just has to look at what the mass of people produces. So it's important to understand that these things are ultimately distributions. They are curves. And there's a very large number of videos where, frankly, the only audience is a family member, typically my mother. And she's the only one who would love this video, or my family, or what have you. So the important thing here is that's an important function, but it's very hard to imagine that being highly monetized. We have seen some success with what we term as the torso, that is the part between the head and the tail, of people who have good talent and they're professional, but they don't have the kind of budget and sophistication that people in this audience do. And we would like to monetize them as well. I'm sure at the end of the day, this will end up being a 90-10 kind of a percentage, or 90% of the content, or I don't know the exact percentage, will be essentially unmonetizable, but will be valuable to micro niches, families, friends, sports clubs, what have you. And then the head and near head, if you will be where virtually all of the money is made, simply because of the value of professionals.
Okay, Rick, I want to turn to a big topic. I mean, many of the questions. I'll read one question out, and maybe we can get a microphone to Steve Hewlett in the hall as well. This is about regulation. You'll be pleased to hear, chillingly big, almost a monopoly in search, dominant in many other online areas, from maps to video. Do you accept that Google now needs to be regulated more effectively? And is Steve out there? Steve Hewlett? This area, I know, of regulation is also one that interests you. Go for it.
Well, I suppose the point is that one of the consequences of being in the UK, you're 90% of the market in search. You have effectively no competitors, and that means, notwithstanding the fact that you've got there because your system is good, because people like using it, no one's suggesting you've done anything wrong, but de facto you have a monopoly position. And the problem then is that in terms of the way that other people need to run their businesses, people who need to get recognised online and so on, everybody is subject to the Google algorithm, which is a particular algorithm, good as it is, and the fact that there's no competition, you might think in any other marketplace, a 90% share of the business would induce forced separation or some form of at least regulatory oversight. Are you concerned that that is a possibility, or what is your attitude towards it?
Well, the first question I would ask you is, could you give me an example where a regulator would add some value to the scenario that you're describing? So would the regulator order Google to somehow boost some company over another? Would the regulator prevent Google or not allow us to innovate in the ways that we have, which have been proven over time? So it's not obvious to me that, at least as you phrase the question, that the value that the regulator would provide would ultimately produce greater consumer benefit.
Far be it from me, working in British television, to suggest that a regulator could improve anything, because I think our experience is... But notwithstanding that, if somebody drops off the end of your algorithm, kind of where do they go? And it is believed, and I don't say it's true, I don't know, it is believed...
So you would, under your questioning, they would appeal to the Prime Minister, who would order them ranked higher?
Oh, you just don't understand Britain, do you? But yes, essentially the answer is yes, they would. And he'd intervene, especially this one. Anyway, no, look, in essence, the point being that if you drop off the bottom of your algorithm, there's kind of no way you can go. And it is believed by people who run services that could be thought of as potentially competitors to yours, who run smaller scale search engines. They believe, a lot of them, that they drop down the algorithm and that there is Google's own commercial self-interest is playing a role here. And that makes you, the fact you're a 90% player, pretty scary.
So I'm not going to debate what percentage market share we have. If what you're really doing in your question is asking, is the market open for new search players, I would offer you that Microsoft recently did a deal with Yahoo where they are attempting to become a very strong second tier and eventually have said that they want to be the leader. I would also observe to you that Google really is one click away from our consumers deciding that we are not the best choice. Unlike, for example, Microsoft, where it's relatively difficult to move off of their platform because you have all of this investment in software and so forth. If you literally prefer Bing, it's easy for you simply to point your browser to a different one. And so I disagree with some of the fundamental assertions that you have made. Having said that, I think that anybody who has as large a role in information as Google does should expect that people will watch what we do and people will try to figure out. Both the governments have a natural view of information, that it's important that it be done fairly and, of course, according to their own laws and culture. And also competitors will do their very best to induce governments to try to regulate us to basically create an unfair advantage for them. We would argue very strongly that the Internet today is largely unregulated and successful for a reason. We also work very, very hard with governments around the world to make sure they understand how we actually operate. There's always this question of, well, you could run the company differently. And I say, well, if that's true, then let's deal with that later. But we say over and over again that we run the company based on, as best we can tell, consumer benefit. And as long as we remain open and consumer-focused, I think we're going to be fine in the regulatory bodies. To answer your question, again, as precisely as I can. It's when companies start to do things which are not in consumers' interest, but are in the best interest of their own business, that eyebrows get raised. So from our perspective, imagine any of the scenarios you described. If we did something which had real consumer harm, first, consumers would complain. Second, the media would complain very, very vociferously. And third, we would probably be affected by regulators at that point.
And Eric, if I can ask, I mean, the world's changing dramatically. We've got, to some extent, in the UK, in Europe, and also globally, legacy regulations and regulatory bodies. Do you think regulation needs to change? You know, it may well be that you quite, in some ways, favour a world in which regulators are focused intensely on areas of content like linear television and don't focus on the internet. But is there anything you would like to see change in the regulatory world?
Well, again, I'm concerned when we have this conversation, the word regulation means something to different people. We are already regulated in the following sense. We are governed by the laws of each of the countries in which we operate in. So we are completely governed by the European laws, the European data privacy laws, and so forth, as are all of the other internet sites. So it's not fair to say that our industry is sort of the Wild West, using the American phrase. The real question is, should there be a firm which regulates the private companies that comprise the internet? And I'm clearly opposed to that. My real concern is actually the inverse. What I'm beginning to see and what we're beginning to be very worried about is that countries, not in Europe, thank goodness, and not in the United States, are beginning to aggressively moderate or manage content on the internet. And they do so under the rubric of societal benefit or pornography or so forth, but it often ultimately affects political dissent. And to have a proper functioning democracy, you have to have multiple voices, you have to have a free press, you have to have people willing to stick their necks out and report on stories and have controversy and so forth. And if governments are going to somehow quell that and make their systems less transparent, I think it's a disservice to the citizens of their country. The internet was designed to be open and to have all of the voices of the world, including the ones that you don't like, and all the behaviors that you don't like, be visible. And it's always a surprise to people when they look on the internet and they see people behaving badly. But people were behaving badly before, you just couldn't see it. I'm not endorsing that, but that transparency is fundamental, we think, to the success of the internet.
Okay, now I'd like to just see if in the hall there's some other questions for Eric. There's one there. Sir. Sharon.
Hi, Eric. My name is Sharon Bailey. I work at the BBC. You mentioned about the onset of new technologies where boxes in the homes are going to open up the ability for online access. And of course, in the UK, that will also mean a much greater broadband pipe to enable access to that content online, which makes it much more accessible for everybody. When that happens, the YouTube model of sort of short-form content perhaps may expand into an ability to access longer-form content and in a Hulu-like way provide a whole different and new programming experience of providing content to those consumers. I'm interested to know how you feel about that, your potential proposition in that space. Is that something that you feel YouTube and perhaps Google through YouTube will want to start to offer proactively as a provider of long-form content that you could then monetize through advertising? And do you have a competitive response to Hulu in the States that you might see also propagate itself when Hulu comes here to the UK?
Well, the good news is we've actually just announced a product very similar to the one you're describing. We are now able to handle long-form content from licensed from significant studios. We've announced a set of deals and many more in the work. And they all have the property that you described, which is their advertising supported, because that's sort of Google's business today. Eventually, you can imagine that we would offer other forms, subscriptions, and so forth to get the video. So we try not to pick favorites between the studios and the formats. We simply want to be a provider at the sort of services and pipe level. In the UK, you actually have a national broadband plan, which includes, I believe, a tariff and so forth for getting everybody up to 1 or 2 megabits per second, regardless of where they are within the United Kingdom. And I think that kind of a step is a necessary precondition to really the broad rollout of these kinds of things. But I think over the next few years, as we discussed earlier, it's reasonable to expect the average British citizen to have a box which connects both to whatever the antenna and cable systems they have, as well as directly into the internet, and that internet connection will be sufficiently fast that much of what they consume can be watched, and that companies like Google and YouTube and companies like Hulu, with whom we are sort of friendly and also compete, both benefit from the creation of that new platform. I should also say that people often do not appreciate the power of the internet speed moving forward. It is technically possible now to build 1 gigabit per second networks, although they're not deployed. It is common, for example, Japan has 100 megabit internets, and in that 100 megabits you can stream and carry, for example, all of the current video and so forth. At a gigabit you can probably stream and carry virtually all of the content that you would ever want to watch, and of course that number will only go higher. And so the fiber optic revolution is continuing. There's every reason to believe that the inversion, right, where basically telephony used to be wired and telephone used to be in the air, is going to reverse, and the telephony will essentially be a wireless phenomena, and that very high quality, very high bandwidth viewing will be over a fiber connection.
Very good. I'll take one more from the hall. One more question here.
Hi, Eric. It's Kate Bulkley. It's Kate Bulkley here, Eric. I'm a journalist here in the UK, but I have an American accent. You talked a little bit about content already. One of the things that Google started out saying, you were cataloging the world. You weren't really a content creator. You were just a way for people to get to content. You now seem to be moving much more into content, like with the digital books. What we're interested in here, we've talked a little bit about how to put more money back into the UK. Would you consider commissioning programming? You know, we've seen Bebo commission programming. We've seen MySpace commission programming. You've talked quite extensively about the need for democracy and different views. Well, news would obviously love to get a little money as well. What are Google's views about commissioning programming from the UK?
So far, we have held a line at that point. If you look at the actions that we've taken, almost all of them have essentially been to make the content quicker, more available, more generally available, more easily licensed, more easily advertised. We haven't caused it to be created. We haven't purchased it. We haven't started paying for it. And the closer we get to that, the more nervous I get, is that we would then become a content provider, which would then create a competitive issue with the other content providers for whom we depend for high-quality content. So far, we define ourselves not as a content provider, but as a technology company, literally an inventor of new products that enable people to get to the content that much more quickly. So I think it's unlikely we would take the kind of steps that you're describing. Many people, because we make a lot of money from advertising, would like us to simply write a large check in their direction, which would be good for them, obviously. But that form of subsidy is not ultimately a good industrial model, because it ultimately would be subject to all sorts of pressures. It's much better for us to work with content providers to find advertising and licensing models where they can actually jointly make money with us, where the vast majority of the money goes to the content provider, and ultimately these are large and profitable business, and that is our strategic direction.
Okay, Eric, I'm going to ask you one last question we got on a card. The question is, on average, how many times do you Google yourself each day? The questioner goes on to say, I've already Googled myself 4 times, and it's only lunchtime. It had to be David Kogan, by the way. I think we should broaden this question and just tell us a little bit about some of the ways you and yours use Google.
Well, to me, the most interesting thing about Google is how did I live without it beforehand? I was trying to think about how did I make decisions in my previous jobs before Google existed. And you had sort of knowledge that other people told you. They told you some fact or something, and it sort of made sense. And now, essentially, every assertion, every question can be checked. And I've learned to be skeptical. Somebody will say, well, did you know, or did you know, or did you know? And I'll say, well, let me check, and let me just make sure. And often the stories that I'm told are embellished, or they're not quite accurate. And so from my perspective, Google allows you to have a much more precise lifestyle. I actually know whether the following thing occurred at this time. So for me, that's been the great personal enjoyment of having essentially an encyclopedia with you all the time. We have a lot of products that are coming that make that much stronger. The classic example is you're walking down a street holding your mobile, and your mobile should be able to tell you the entire history as you're walking along. I was on a train line, and I was bored. I had nothing else to do, so I studied the history of the train line, which turned out to be fascinating. There's all sorts of things you can do when you have an idle moment if you're curious. So I hope what Google does is it makes us all be much more intellectually curious about the world around us. It provides a more interesting life, and it also makes us a more educated citizenry.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eric, for taking the time to join us and for offering us such a great and different insight and perspective onto the debates we're having. If I can ask everyone to join me in thanking Eric Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good.